Welcome to Work Effectively with People with a Disability, Session 5, Conducting a Person-Centered Risk Assessment. People with disability need to engage in some level of risk-taking to be able to acquire a greater level of independence and quality of life. All people take risks, and what that gives us is a sense of competence and the opportunity to develop skills or to reinforce a sense of capacity. Duty of care can sometimes appear incongruent with allowing people to take risks, particularly if they do have a disability, because a priority is always to keep clients safe. However, everyone in life takes risks, so a clear risk assessment that is done in advance and done with appropriate planning really helps clients to make informed decisions about risks and meets duty of care requirements for workers as well. So rather than eliminating all risks for clients, workers can actually support clients to manage risk so that they can engage fully in all aspects of life. So this session will be looking at what risk assessment is and how to undertake a person-centered risk assessment, and we'll end by applying it to a case study. So let's begin by looking at what is risk assessment. It's a process of analysing potential risks associated with an individual participating in an activity or program. Workers need to know what their responsibility is in any identified case of harm or risk of harm to a client. They need to clarify their reporting requirements within the organisation that they're working for. The Victorian Risk Framework outlines 4 dimensions of risks that must be considered to make a judgment of the level of risk or real risk to a person. So let's look at this. The first dimension is severity of anticipated harm, and this refers to the type and degree of harm that has been or is likely to be experienced by a client with a disability. The factors relating to vulnerability and patterns of past harm are taken into account to estimate the severity of any future harm. Then the next dimension is vulnerability to harm, and this involves looking at factors relating to the person's age, aspects of their development or functioning, and the opportunity for harm or for protection. Then the dimension likelihood of anticipated harm refers to occurring, continuing, or recurring likelihood of harm for the client. And the last dimension is safety for the person, which refers to factors that decrease the probability of harm, including positive relationships, skills, and personality. When assessing risk, we really do need to look at what is considered unacceptable risk to our clients. So any physical harm to the person with disability, any physical harm to workers, carers, or family, any emotional harm that includes embarrassment or distress to the person with disability, or any damage to property and resources, and these are all considered unacceptable risk. When assessing risk with a client, we can conduct a risk rating, which is used to determine the magnitude, the severity, and level of probability of risk and its consequences. So an example of a rating system is 4 levels, or 5 levels, pardon me, which begins with low, mild, moderate, high, and acute. And we look at the probability of risk and also the consequence to the client when determining the risk. So a low risk is where there might be minor injury to the client or another person due to something that the client does or doesn't do, and it requires first aid or no response. A mild risk is a minor physical or psychological injury to the client or another person due to the client's action, which does require first aid. A moderate risk is where there's the client fears death or serious physical injury or damage to property from a threat. The client is threatening another person with death or serious injury. There's fear of damage to property following a threat, or there's been harm to animals. A high risk is where inadequate care has been given to the client, which leads to hospitalization or institutionalization. Actions and or outcomes of actions that lead to client entering the criminal justice system, or there's been physical or psychological injury to the person that requires medical attention and treatment. And acute risk is where there is actual death of the client or person or another person due to something that the client has done, death of the client because of another person's actions, or physical or psychological injury that requires hospitalization or for the client or another person. When an immediate risk situation arises, workers need to assess the nature of the risk, the potential harm, what alternatives and actions need to be taken to ensure that the client is safe. So when we talk about risk management, it involves the process of identifying and analysing potential risks, which lead to planning and implementing appropriate controls to ensure safety and minimise risk of harm where possible. So let's look at the person-centred risk assessment process. This was recommended by Kinsella and helps workers to assess everyday risk and to develop strategies that facilitate a balance between client safety and personal happiness. So beginning with the first step, a worker needs to clarify what the risk is. So looking at actual risk associated with a choice or action which needs to be named and identified using very clear and specific language. So we might say, a worker might say, look, I'm really concerned that Ken is going to be hurt when he goes for a walk to the shops. That's a very ambiguous way of naming a risk. A more specific way would be to say, I'm really worried that Ken might be hit by a car when he's crossing the road on his way to the shops. For the second step, we're needing to determine responsibility to make sure that the concern is actually specifically related to the responsibility of a worker, or that it falls within an organisational responsibility and that there are policies and procedures around this concern or issue. Then the third step is to analyse the likelihood and severity of possible outcomes. So that's looking at predictions of the likelihood and severity of possible adverse outcomes. So we look at the history for that particular client with a disability. Have they done this action before? If it didn't go well, is it likely to happen again? We look at changes in circumstances. Perhaps the client has developed new skills or gained knowledge that will help them to be able to engage in the action and at a reduced risk. Number 4 means assessing the consequences of the choice or action. So this is where the worker looks at the impact of the risks associated with the choice or action, and any potential injury or damage that might occur. Number 5 is the process of assessing potential opportunity loss. So that's where we consider what will the person miss out on if they're restricted from taking the risk. Number 6 is considering strategies to reduce or help the client manage risk. So that means considering ways to reduce the likelihood of negative outcomes for the client, and that might mean making adjustments to the immediate environment to make it safer, changing routines, staff, supervising and guiding or training clients until that risk has been minimized. And lastly, there needs to be consideration of the balance between what is safe and also the person's personal happiness, what they will achieve and gain from actually taking the risk. So where possible, we're wanting to achieve a balance between happiness and safety. If there is a high degree of happiness, so if the client wants to do something that will be really rewarding to them, but it's highly dangerous, well, clearly safety has to be prioritized. However, if there is a high level of safety and it means that the client has to miss out on an action because the worker is being overly cautious, then that's really disempowering to the client. So where possible, we're wanting to achieve that balance between safety and personal happiness to the client. So let's look at John's story in terms of applying this person-centered risk assessment model. John has an intellectual disability and lives in a group home. He's supported by a team who believes that it would be too risky to allow John to wash the dishes, as they're afraid that he'll drink the dishwashing liquid. So as a result, John is not allocated this chore, and so he hasn't had the opportunity to learn how to do the dishes. He's always been overlooked for this task because the team has made the assumption that it would be too dangerous for him to wash dishes. A new supervisor comes on board and queries this with the staff. Based on the supervisor's observations of John, they start to question why John isn't allocated dishwashing from time to time. It's established that John has actually never consumed dishwashing liquid or any other potentially harmful substance. So this throws into question the assumptions made by the team and that they've been overly cautious. What we learn is that 5 years earlier, another resident in the group home did ingest laundry powder. And so based on that other resident's behaviour, John's actions have been restricted. So what would be helpful is, what would occur is the supervisor would sit down with the team and using a person-centered risk assessment process, they would ask really important questions. So they would say, let's clarify what the risk is. What is your major concern for John? And the staff would say, look, we're really worried that given his intellectual disability and the fact he's never washed dishes before, that he might actually drink the dishwashing liquid and poison himself. So that's the actual risk. Secondly, the supervisor would determine responsibility, and the staff would say, look, we're responsible for John's safety. That's why we've been cautious. We're responsible for allocating chores in a safe manner, and we don't want to put any of the residents at risk. So it's determined that, yes, the staff are responsible for undertaking a risk assessment on behalf of John. Then the third step, the supervisor would look at analysing the likelihood or severity of possible outcomes. So this is where they start to question, is there a history of John actually ingesting harmful liquids? And the staff say, well, no, John hasn't ever drunk the dishwashing liquid, but we did have a fellow who drank some laundry powder about 5 years ago. And we just don't, it went terrible and we don't want that to happen. So what emerges is that because of that historical event, the staff are being quite overly cautious. So then they assess the consequences of the choice or action, and they ask, what do you reckon? What if we allow John or train John with some level of guidance and supervision and support to wash the dishes? is there a high risk? Is the risk acute that he would, drink dishwashing liquid and poison himself? Or is it low? Or is it moderate? And in this case, just based on the snapshot we have, we'd probably assess it at being very low. It's not likely that John will drink the dishwashing liquid because there's no history of him doing so. And with some additional support, he might actually be able to internalize the idea, learn to do that action in a very safe way. Then the fifth step is to assess the potential opportunity that is lost for John if he's restricted. So if John is not given the opportunity to do the dishes, it's a skill that he will never acquire. And it's an important skill in terms of giving him a level of independence, but also the opportunity to contribute to home life within the group home, and also to develop a sense of achievement and competence within himself. Then the sixth step is where the team would consider strategies to reduce or manage the risk to allow John to participate in that action. So what would be determined, the staff would kind of consider ways to reduce any likelihood of John drinking the dishwashing liquid. So they might decide John will be supported in learning to wash the dishes. He will be given very specific instructions. There might be different ways in which safety is communicated. So there might be a verbal discussion. There might also be signs placed at the sink, specifying that they, images that clearly indicate that there is to be no drinking of dishwashing liquid, and amongst other safety steps. And that John might need some supervision and support initially. So he might be allocated a buddy. So perhaps the fellow who's been doing the dishes, maybe one of the other residents, can actually partner up with John and support him while he picks up those new skills. And so the seventh step of the person-centered risk assessment process is to consider that balance between safety and personal happiness. So it would be reasonable to expect that the team determines that risk is low, and the opportunity to wash dishes might actually contribute to John's sense of personal efficacy and happiness because he's one of the team. He's someone who's participating to home life. And perhaps John has shown an interest. Maybe he's asked to do the dishes in the past and he was denied that opportunity. So that would be the way in which you would apply that process as a team in terms of actioning something for a client. And it also shows how workers can facilitate full participation in social life and community life within a group home. I hope that that's clarified some of your learning around risk assessment, and I encourage you to read the other content in your study guide. Thanks for listening.